Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you all again for our monthly series of lectures organized by the IIT Gandhinagar's Archaeological Sciences Center. So this is our ninth lecture in this series, and today we are having Dr. Dennys Frenez, who is from University of Bologna, Italy, who will be talking on a very interesting topic, the kind of contacts the Harappans had with Mesopotamia and the intervening region, that is Oman, Bahrain, all these regions, they participated in an intercultural and interregional trade mechanism. So today we are going to listen to some of the new findings, new interpretations from the primary source itself, because Dennys has been working in this area for a pretty long time, and he, along with Professor Maurizio Tosi, they have indeed brought Oman into the limelight and the contacts we had with the Mesopotamian region. So to introduce Dennys, he doesn't need introduction, but for the sake of the participants, I introduce Dennys. He completed his PhD from University of Bologna in 2011, and he is investigating the commercial and cross-cultural interactions between urban level societies in South and Middle Asia, approximately of the Bronze Age, the third millennium and the second millennium BCE. So with this special focus on the Indus and Magan civilizations, many of you might be knowing Magan refers to the Oman region, and it is mentioned in the cuneiform records of Sargon of Akkad. So he has a wide experience on these issues with his wide range of theoretical and methodological approaches. And also he is particularly looking into the sealings from the ancient cultures of the Harappan civilization, as well as from other cultures, which help in understanding the ancient administrative and writing systems, and also looking into the traditional technologies and crafts, iconography and art styles, socioeconomic and political organization. He has also organized and directed excavations in India and Sultanate of Oman both, and has worked on the various collections from several museums in India, Pakistan, Oman, UAE, Tajikistan and Turkmenistan. So he has an extensive experience on this aspect, looking into artifacts from different regions, different countries, different cultures. And in this context, it is much important to us because in the ancient past, also Harappans, they had a wide contact with various regions, and we need to understand all these aspects, taking into account the evidence in different parts of this part of the world. So recently, he is working closely with the government of Sultanate of Oman, with the Ministry of Heritage and Culture. We have been discussing before the start of the lecture how he is actively participating in various events of the Ministry of Heritage and Culture, Sultanate of Oman. So I welcome Dennys, and I really thank you for sparing your valuable time to deliver this lecture. And I also welcome all the participants, and I also thank them for listening to our lectures on a monthly basis, and also supporting us in a great manner. So the floor is now open to Dennys, and I request Dennys to deliver the lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again, and good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks to all participants for connecting to follow this web talk about the commercial and cultural interaction between the Indus civilization and the contemporaneous Umm an-Nar culture of the Oman Peninsula, which broadly includes present-day Oman, north of Masira, and the Emirates east of Abu Dhabi. In the first part of my presentation, I'm going to define archaeological concepts like the Middle Asian interaction sphere, the Umm an-Nar culture, and the land of Magan, which some of you may not be familiar with. I'm also going to explain what I mean in this context for glocal and glocalization in present-day economic theory and how they can be applied to an ancient society. Before starting the actual presentation, I wish to thank Jonathan Markenoyer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US and Sophie Méry from the University of Rennes in France, who collaborated to produce most of the new data that constitutes the basis of this presentation. I wish to thank also the Ministry of Heritage and Tourism and the National Museum of the Sultanate of Oman for having granted the necessary permissions to study the Indus-related objects found in the country. Of course, this was only possible after receiving the necessary clearances from the different teams that owned the intellectual rights on the objects. Last but not least, I wish to thank my colleagues and longtime friends Bien Prabhakar and Michel Danino from IIT Gandhinagar for having invited me to present this my research in this important and prestigious venue. I had the honor to be research guest of IIT Gandhinagar back in 2015, and I hope there will be a chance to resume the collaboration in the near future. Let me spend a few words on the reason why I'm here today with you. As you know, my main research focus is the Indus civilization. Since about 15 years, I'm researching on several aspects of its administrative technology and organization. I did my master's thesis on the clay ceilings from Lothal, and I also had the chance to study those from Dolavira in collaboration with Prabhakar and Michel. In the meantime, I completed my doctoral dissertation about the role played by Indus merchants and craftsmen in the so-called Middle Asian interaction sphere. The main goal of my research was to understand if, and in case how, Indus traders tried to adapt local traditional Indus production to fulfill different demands from the local markets they were trying to commercially penetrate. After that, in 2013, I was called as a consultant to the Ministry of Heritage and Culture of Oman to organize a section about Oman-India relationship in the new National Museum. The research I'm going to present today actually began in that occasion, but it was further developed also through targeted excavations. From 2016, in fact, I work as the scientific coordinator of the Italian-American Joint Project, which excavates the Umm an-Nar site HD1 at Ras Salad on the central coast of Oman. In the past, in past excavation by the British Museum, the site, in fact, yielded a great number of different Indus pottery types. This project is directed by Maurizio Cattani from the University of Bologna and Mark Neuer from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So, the main aim of today's presentation is to discuss the preliminary outcomes of the joint research that I carried out with Mark Neuer and Sophie Marie about the organization and significance of the commercial and cultural interactions between traders from the Indus Valley and the Umm an-Nar communities of southeastern Arabia. Sorry. Broadly including present-day Oman north of Mazira and the Emirates east of Abu Dhabi during the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. In particular, I want to present the multidisciplinary approach that eventually made us proposing a novel paradigm to explain the mechanism of mutual interaction between these two trading communities in a more organic and structured way. Needless to say, to quote Isaac Newton, that this possible advancement in our understanding of this phenomenon was only possible by standing on the shoulders of giants. In fact, without the seminal research by the late Serge Crézieux and Maurizio Tosi, our work would only be a drop in the ocean. By the way, I'm pleased to inform you that if you are interested in the archaeology of prehistoric Oman, the Ministry of Heritage and Tourism has recently released a second expanded edition of the seminal volume In the Shadow of the Ancestors, written by Crézieux and Tosi, which is now available in both hard copy and digital version on ArchaeoPress. As most of you probably know, the commercial and cultural exchanges between the Indus Valley and Oman was only one single component of a more complex and extensive network of reciprocal interactions that occurred during the 3rd millennium across the entire Middle Asia, a region stretching from the Indus to eastern Syria and from Oman to northern Afghanistan. The participation of Indus traders in the Middle Asian interaction sphere is immediately perceivable by the almost ubiquitous distribution of Indus-style ornaments in carnelian, namely the long biconical and the decorated bleach beads. They have been found, in fact, in all regions of Middle Asia and even beyond, up to Middle Egypt, the Central Mediterranean, and Southern Caucasus. However, we probably had more insights into the complexity and organization of Indus external trade from the great number of Indus type and Indus-related seals found in these regions. As expected, we have several examples of the characteristic Indus stamp seals with an inscription in Indus signs above a standing male animal. However, we can now follow quite precisely also the process of cultural hybridization that led to the local production of seals with Indus features translated into the different local administrative and artistic traditions. Moreover, we documented the widespread introduction in the last centuries of the 3rd millennium BC of a new round seal type, which together with the representation of an Indian bison, seems to have identified specifically the Indus merchant active in external trade. Interestingly, on the other side, the discovery of exotic items from West Asia in the Indus Valley was very limited and apparently only the result of occasional exchanges. Some solid pieces of evidence make thinking that, together with trade items and merchants, Indus craftspeople were also extensively traveling across Middle Asia, playing thus a pivotal role in shaping this phenomenon. In demonstrating that a great number of carnelian beads found in Ur were made by using techniques and technology mastered only in the Indus Valley, Mark and Hoyer also proposed that Indus bead makers were actually active in Mesopotamia. In fact, some faceted beads in carnelian found at Ur were made copying local Mesopotamian traditional shapes like these in lapis lazuli and gold, which were not in vogue in the Indus Valley. However, the carnelian specimens were all perforated using Indus-type constricted cylindrical drills, making us proposing that they were actually made by Indus bead makers working in Mesopotamia. For this same period, I also found evidence of Indus itinerant ivory carvers active in Central Asia. This model, also supported by later historical textual sources, is based on the widespread discovery of ivory carvings in the region, most of which were made following local traditions in material culture and art style. The co-occurrence of Indus-style ivory objects, however, made rational proposing the existence of itinerant ivory carvers who brought the task along and offered the skills they acquired in the Indus Valley, where elephant was still endemic. It is also my strong belief that after an early phase where Indus-type standard seals were also used for external trade, a second and third generation of Indus-related seals were produced locally in the different regions of Middle Asia. Typical Indus iconographies were, in fact, adapted to the local seal types and art styles. The widespread use of fire steatite, which was characteristic of Indus seals only, and some idiosyncrasies in the carving techniques, iconographic treatment, and even in rare cases, also in the use of local writing systems, made me thinking that most of these seals were produced locally by Indus seal makers. It is also interesting to notice that the only certain evidence that we have so far about the presence of individuals native in the Indus Valley in Mesopotamia refers to shepherds. Hence, it refers to individuals employed by local economic organization in consideration of their unique expertise in a specialized activity. In this framework, the existence of a few exceptional seals with clear Indus features but inscription in Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform, a linear Elamite, is definitely striking. They all indicated names and patronymics from either the local onomastics or an unknown linguistic tradition, most likely the phonetical adaptation of original Indus names. I'm about to publish a paper on these seals in collaboration with Assyriologist Gianni Marchesi from the University of Bologna and Massimo Vidale from the University of Padua, where we will discuss the different possible interpretations of these complex hybrid objects. It is becoming increasingly clear that the Indus components, and apparently more the producer than the sellers, played a very dynamic and pivotal role in setting this phenomenon by dedicating specific attention to both the global aspects and the different regional markets on a local scale. This is the reason why I use the term glocal and glocalization in the title of this presentation. Let me open now a short parenthesis on the definition of glocalization. This term was introduced by sociologist Roland Robertson in the 80s to indicate the simultaneity and the co-presence of both universalizing and particularizing tendencies in contemporary social, political, and economic systems. In other words, glocalization provides the proactive adaptation of global products to the local context they are planned to be used and sold in. A typical example of glocalization is McDonald's, a company that made its fortune in the USA by selling beef hamburgers. However, when they decided to go global, they had to adapt their menu to meet the different local tradition and tastes. And India is the best example of this trend, of course, because McDonald's do not even serve beef, for evident reasons. However, a global marketing strategy does not only consider the local taste for specific production and styles, but also the administrative and legal framework. In this sense, we can apply this concept also to ancient societies and the Indus civilization external trade in particular. If you are interested in this concept and its application to archaeological context, I'm happy to inform you that an interesting and comprehensive volume on the subject is about to be released. And you can find the information to eventually purchase it on the bottom of this slide. Before seeing how Oman fits into this general picture of Indus external trade and how it contributes to further define its features, I want to describe the general characteristics of the socioeconomic and cultural developments of this region in the 3rd millennium BC. First of all, I will use the term Oman in a wrong way. In fact, the region of our interest encompassed present-day Oman only north of the island of Mazira and to the east of Al-Hajar Mountains, and the UAE east of Abu Dhabi. As we will see now, this region was interested by a coherent cultural development during the Bronze Age, which can also be called the land of Magan or the civilization of Magan, to use the same terms used in the cuneiform text to define it. This region had a sociocultural development comparable to those of the neighboring regions. However, for specific reasons, the local communities never developed a political organization based on centralization and hierarchy, but on tribal alliance and kinship bonds. After having witnessed an early presence of our human ancestors in the spread out of Africa during the Paleolithic, Oman had a long adaptation to Neolithic. Omani Neolithic was mainly based on the pastoralism of sheep and goats, but it still had a significant component from hunting, fishing, and gathering. In fact, dry agriculture based on rain only was not possible in such an extremely arid environment. Farming along the foothills of Al-Hajar Mountains began only at the end of the 3rd millennium BC, during the so-called Hapit period, thanks to the development of artificial irrigation systems. This phase can be somehow compared, not only chronological, to the early Harappan phase in the Indus region. In fact, it witnessed the prototypical establishment of most cultural features that mark the later Bronze Age culture. Among them, we can see also the establishment of long-distance overseas exchanges. In fact, even if irrigation system was most likely an indigenous conception, most cultivars that provided the basis for all this economy were imported from overseas to trade. At the end of the third millennium BC is marked by the construction of large villages, including several mud brick buildings with stone foundations, which had distinctive residential and productive sectors. The food surplus made available thanks to the refinement of hunting and fishing techniques, the intensification of animal breeding, and most of all, the development of artificially irrigated farming allowed some Neolithic groups to devote important human resources to expand and intensify some non-utilitarian activities like softstone and copper working. Interregional exchanges in raw materials, finished goods, and technical expertise eventually fostered the nucleation of human groups in specific strategic locations, leading permanent settlements to eventually arise. In contrast to the very few permanent settlements known for these periods, the new sociocultural setting developed in the Fifth period is testified nowadays mainly by the widespread distribution along the summit of fields and rocky ridges of thousands of large truncated cone tombs made of local stone slabs. For the first time, funerary structures were used in Oman to receive the mortal remains of more than one individual through time, usually up to 6. The introduction of this new burial practice testifies to the increased social importance of family and kinship bonds and the ritual worship of the ancestors. The grave goods mainly included ornaments and tools made locally from local raw materials. However, in some cases, a Fifth-type grave also included one single gemmed nuts vessel imported from southern Mesopotamia. The reason for the establishment of long-distance trade between these two regions was the beginning of copper working in Oman around the mid-4th millennium BC. Based on the result of geochemical analysis, the use of Omani copper in Mesopotamia can be traced down to the second half of the 4th millennium BC, at the same time of earliest evidence for copper working in Oman. The Fifth period, which can be considered the Chalcolithic of Oman, was followed by the so-called Umm an-Nar period, which is broadly contemporaneous to the Indus civilization. Basically, we can consider the Fifth period as the formative phase for the Umm an-Nar period, which is conceptually the same process documented in the Greater Indus Valley for the early and mature Harappan phases. The Umm an-Nar period witnessed a widespread intensification of sedentary settlement following the consolidation of irrigated oasis farming. The establishment of inland oasis settlements is marked by the appearance of mysterious megalithic stone platforms, conventionally called towers. These structures had a diameter ranging from 20 to 25 meters for a height up to several meters. The internal space formed a foundation for like structure built atop the tower. A stone-lined water well was usually excavated in the center, while a deep ditch often surrounded them. The function of these towers remained a matter of debate between those who interpret them as fortified elite residences, structures related to irrigation and agriculture, or even ritual buildings. During the 3rd millennium BC, the communal stone tombs became much larger, ranging from 5 to 15 meters in diameter, and included 2 or more funerary chambers, sometimes with more than one level. After centuries of continuous use by the same family or tribe, such tombs arrived to contain from a dozen to several hundreds individuals, buried with rich grave goods, often including many items imported from overseas regions, mainly from the Indus Valley. In contrast to the neighboring cultures in Mesopotamia, Iran, and the Indus Valley, which all developed hierarchical urban societies, the Umm an-Nar communities of Oman continued to be based on a poorly stratified tribal system linked by strong kinship bonds rather than political centralization. Still, cultural and commercial exchanges with overseas regions are among the most distinct traits of this period in Oman. For what concerns the wider scenario, as you know, in the 24th century BC, Mesopotamia witnessed a dramatic change in its political organization when Sargon of Akkad conquered the Sumerian city-states in the south and expanded its direct political influence over parts of Syria, Anatolia, and western Iran. Sargon sent Akkadian governors to rule the cities he conquered and made Akkadian the official language in all his empire. One of the central points in Sargon's political agenda was the promotion of long-distance trade with the neighboring regions. This plan is perfectly exemplified in a propagandistic text claiming that boats from distant foreign countries moored at the quay of Agad, its capital city. Such countries were spelled in order of distance from Mesopotamia: Dilmun, Magan, and Melucha. After decades of combining philological and archaeological research, scholars now agree on identifying Dilmun with Bahrain, Kuwait, and eastern Saudi Arabia, Melucha with Baluchistan, the Indus Valley, and Gujarat, and Magan with Oman north of Masira Island and the UAE east of Abu Dhabi. From that moment, Magan began to be mentioned in several propagandistic inscriptions from different Akkadian rulers, as well as in economic texts dating to the following third dynasty of Ur at the end of the third millennium BC. An inscription by Sargon's sons, King Manishtushu, tells about a battle fought in the land of Magan between his army and a coalition of 32 towns led by local lords. This is most likely the textual confirmation that Oman was organized as a federation of tribal groups rather than a centralized monarchy. In the Umm an-Nar period, the use of Omani copper in Mesopotamia increased up to reaching more than half of the analyzed object in the Akkadian period. However, despite propagandistic claims by various Akkadian rulers, the archaeological presence of Mesopotamian materials in Oman is quite limited throughout the second half of the third millennium BC. On the contrary, as we will see from a few slides onward, Indus materials are almost ubiquitous at Umm an-Nar sites dating to the second half of the third millennium BC, including both the settlements and tombs. Other cuneiform texts from this period tell about the construction in southern Mesopotamia of Magan-type boats, which were made tying together reed bundles to form a hull, eventually clothed with mats and covered in bitumen. Such boats were likely to sail down the Arabian Gulf, in the Sea of Oman, up to Ras al-Jins, where hundreds of pieces of their bituminous layers were discovered. Such bitumen pieces were likely derived from maintenance activities necessary for such boats to sail back to Mesopotamia. About 20 years ago, Professor Maurizio Tosi began a challenging project for the experimental replication of one of such Magan-type boats, which culminate with the construction of a 13-meter-long vessel that should have sailed from Sur in Oman to Mandvi in Gujarat. Unfortunately, it sank in its maiden voyage just a dozen kilometers off the coast of Oman. By the way, Dr. Alok Tripathi was on board of the vessel that sank as a representative of the Archaeological Survey of India. However, even if this last and most mediatic event failed, the scientific community learned a lot from this project. Let's now enter into the core of today's talk, presenting the Indus type and Indus-related finds discovered in Umm an-Nar settlements and tombs across Oman. I will show you first what was known from previous work when we began our research in 2013 to conclude with our specific contribution to this topic. A few Indus bleach-decorated beads and logged biconical beads in carnelian were known mainly from sites in the Emirates. More recently, some specimens came to light also in Oman, and I will describe them later in higher detail. Oman did not provide a great number of Indus-related seals, but they are very significant. Despite being very diversified in shape, raw materials, and iconography, they have strict parallels in the Indus Valley. An Indus-type copper seal identical to that from Ras Al Jeans has been found in the Indus Valley only at Lothal, which is known for having provided evidence of likely direct commercial contacts with Ras Al Jeans. I hope that, by the way, that one day we will be allowed to analyze the provenance of the copper used to produce these seals, these two seals, since both the Indus Valley and Oman were had copper minerals and were produced copper, so they might have been both from the same regions or the other regions, or just local copies made, one in the Indus Valley and one in Oman. The two sites, Ras Al Jeans and Lothal, also yielded comparable rectangular seals made by reworking the lid of Umm an-Nar type softstone boxes. The specimen from Oman had carved human figures and vegetal motifs, while the seals from Lothal has an inscription in Indus signs. Other seals from sites in Oman have iconographies clearly inspired to typical Indus motifs or shapes unique to Indus-related seals from the Greater Gulf region. They perfectly fit into the phenomenon of cultural hybridization that interested the Indus-related seals found in other regions of Middle Asia. Umm an-Nar settlements and tombs also yielded a variety of miscellaneous Indus-related objects, including ivory combs, metal tools, terracotta toys, and now even silver rings. One of these rings, from the site of Dawa in the hinterland of Sohar, bears the image of an Indian bison with the head lower, which is considered to have been the symbol of Indus merchant trading abroad. This exceptional piece is still under study for manufacturing provenance, so I thank Kimberly Williams from Temple University for allowing me to show it to an international audience for the first time. And I kindly ask you not to share this slide on the social. Let's now talk about pottery. Indus pottery is very abundant in Oman. The presence of Indus black slip storage jars is even considered an archaeological marker for Umm an-Nar sites. In addition to such large storage jars, we have black on red painted jars and other pottery types related to food production and presentation, like the characteristic perforated jars, pedestal dishes, cooking pots, and now also pointed base goblets. The abundance of Indus pottery in Oman compared to other regions linked with the Harappan external trade is not easy to explain. Some external factors may have led to paying more attention to the presence of Indus pottery in Oman. However, the numbers involved are so different that we should also try to identify the systemic factors underlying this evidence, the ultimate reason for which may be sought in the specificity of the items traded from the Indus Valley to Oman. Considering the harsh environment of southeastern Arabia, they may have in fact included amounts of staple commodities higher than those destined to regions with far more diversified food productions. Now, I wish to draw your attention to a major factor that, thanks to the seminal work by Sophie Méry, emerged quite clearly already in the late 90s, the significant presence of Indus pottery types produced in Oman using local clay wares. Petrographic studies allow Sophie to detect the presence of various sites of Indus pedestal dishes and perforated jars, the clay fabric of which did not match the typical Indus ware, but rather the local red sandy ware. At the time, this phenomenon was explained with the adoption by the local Umm an-Nar communities of new dyery production inspired by contacts with Indus merchants along the coast. Along the same way, the large amounts of Indus black slip jars at Indian sites, which resulted all made in the Indus, were explained with their common reuse to transport imported and local goods from the coast toward the interior. Another remarkable discovery by Sophie was that small carinated vessels with painted Indus motif found in Umm an-Nar tombs, despite having no comparisons in the Indus Valley, were actually made in Sindh. From being the best candidates for a local Omani productions inspired by Indus models, they can now be regarded as the likely example of a skilled production proactively designed and manufactured for a specific local market. This is a perfect exemplification of the reason why I wanted to include the term glocal and glocalization in the title of this talk. Finally, from 2013, we had the chance to study some new important collections, mainly from Salut ST1 and various sites in the Bat area, plus a few small collections acquired by the National Museum of Oman. All sites are located along the Piedmonts of Al Hajar Mountains in the interior of Oman. This collection included several specimens of indoor carnelian beads. The bleach beads resulted being perforated using Indus-style constricted cylindrical drills, but also by packing. The use of packing to perforate long beads in carnelian is documented elsewhere only at the site of Rakmanderi in the Indus Valley. Several Indus-style long carnelian beads were found at Salut and Bat, and we established they were all perforated using Indus constricted cylindrical drills. Moreover, all these beads, both the bleach decorated and the log biconical, were made using carnelian from Gujarat. After the carnelian beads, our attention was immediately captured by a typical Indus-type seal with an inscription in Indus signs above a standing Indian bison, which was found at Salut ST1 by the Italian mission to Oman by the University of Pisa. Thanks to the generous permission by Professor Alessandra Banzini, Mark Neuer and I were able to study this seal in great detail. First of all, I wish to recall that most scholars now agree that the Indian bison or short-horned bull with the head lowered was likely introduced to represent Harappan traders active outside the Indus region. That said, the Indus-type seals from Salut was carved from a chloride that macroscopically resembles the variety locally used for making soft-stone vessels. And chloride was never used in the Indus for making seals. However, in addition to the Salut specimen, we know several other Indus-related seals from Oman and southern Mesopotamia that were made from this material. Remarkably, microscopic studies of the carving using silicon impression show that it was consistent with the techniques established in the Indus Valley for the production of standard seals in false theatre. Moreover, according to both Ascopar Paula and Andreas Fools, who independently carried out text segmentation analysis of all Indus inscriptions, the string of 5 Indus signs fits perfectly with the syntactical organization of the inscription from sites in the Indus Valley. And this evidence is not trivial because they also identified seals from southern Mesopotamia and the Gulf region with anomalous sign sequences, possibly reproducing a language different from those spoken in the Indus Valley. And according to the linguistic evidence we have for the period and the region, this language may have been most likely Amorite. All considered, this seal seems to have been made in interior Oman by an Indus-trained seal maker for an individual represented by the symbol of Indus external traders and with an inscription that seems fitting the Indus onomastics. Possibly even more significant is the discovery at the same site of 2 fragments made from the same jar using the local Salut red sandy ware, which, before being fired, was stamped at least twice using the same elongated seal with an Indus motif of the 2 short-horned bulls in combat and an inscription in Indus sign. in Indus science. At this point, the discovery at the site of several Indus-type toys and games has to be likely considered in a different light. Of course, excavation at Salut and Ba also yielded a significant number of Indus pottery types. What we noticed with some surprise was the high occurrence at both sides of Indus cooking pots. Indus cooking pots were very complex vessels to be manufactured. In fact, the shape and ledge mark in the neck body juncture were designed to deflect the flames and keep the upper part of the vessel at a lower temperature. Thanks to generous permissions from the different teams, we had the chance to implement a long-term program of complementing geochemical tests, including both petrographic studies and neutron activation analysis. Both are still ongoing, but the preliminary results are consistent and very interesting. In particular, the technological and petrographic studies carried out by Sophie Méry revealed that a significant number of Indus pottery specimens were actually manufactured using different local claywares, but specific Indus shaping techniques. For the first time, these locally made Indus pottery containers include also extremely complex shapes, like most Indus-type cooking pots, but also a few examples of large black slip storage jars. Based on experimental studies independently carried out by both Sophie and Mark Neuer over the past decades, both types could have only been produced to such perfection levels by potter masters with years of experience on making those shapes. This pattern seems confirmed by the tentative results from neutron activation analysis coordinated by Mark Neuer. This is a very preliminary scenario that I obtained by processing the rough data. However, we can already see that neutron activation confirmed and further expanded the results of petrographic studies. In fact, it shows the discovery of locally made black slip jars and pedestal dishes also at sites along the coast of Oman. We are still working on reconstructing the patterns of local production and movement across Oman of locally made Indus pottery types. Moreover, in order to complete the picture, we also need to introduce data from Baluchistan. And of course, our dream would be to find Indus pottery containers produced in Oman and shipped back to the Indus. But for the moment, we don't have any evidence for this possibility yet, hopefully in the future. So to sum up, back in the 80s and the 90s, the available data made our colleagues proposing that Indus seafaring merchants landed along the coast of Oman and remained confined to a few sites where they traded with the local communities. The raw materials and commodities subject of mutual exchanges will therefore move back and forth from the interior as the result of local tribal seasonal exchanges, while Indus merchants never ventured inland. Some Indus pottery types were copied locally after the adoption of new culinary habits, while many Indus storage jars were brought inland as the result of their extensive local reuse. Now, we know that there may have been instead a rather stable presence of Indus merchant and craftspeople, at least at some sites in the interior of Oman. Based on the identification of locally made Indus production and on the evidence for the local use of objects deeply rooted into the Indus cultural tradition, we may even venture the hypothesis that native Indus families or Indus natives intermarried with local men and women were settled in the interior of Oman. These would have allowed them to greatly facilitate proactive direct trading with the socioeconomic entities that control the extraction and first processing of copper minerals and some prized metamorphic rocks. Of course, this is still a preliminary working hypothesis. We need to further expand the dataset and circumstantiate all the resulting assumptions. However, it fits what is emerging about the general organization of Indus external trade, with Indus merchant and craftspeople apparently optimizing their marketing strategies to penetrate the local markets by fulfilling the local taste and negotiating the acquisition of strategic resources directly at their source. With a due distinction, in the present economic theory, this market strategy may be seen as a prototype for present-day localization. That's all for today. Many thanks for your kind attention. But before leaving the stage to comments and questions, I wish to inform you that there is another book that could interest you if you enjoy this presentation. It was released by the Italian Embassy in Oman and the International Association for the Study of Mediterranean and the Orient, ISMEO, to celebrate the 40 years of Italian archaeological research in Oman. And it's downloadable for free from the link here below. So if you are interested, please download it. And comments and questions are always more than welcome. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dennys. It was a wonderful talk and many to learn from your talk and the kind of interactions the Harappans had in the 3rd millennium BCE. So before starting the question answer session, I have one question. The way we see evidences of Harappan artifacts, ceramics in Oman, even in all along the coastal areas, is there a possibility of Harappans actually colonizing this area? I mean, they are penetrating so deep inside. I mean, why the traders only have to kind of embark on the coast? I mean, they are going inland, they are looking into so many options. Is there a possibility to say there was some attempts for colonization also?
No, I don't think so, because the Indus component was still a minoritarian component embedded into deeply rooted local culture, local settlements. And for sure, there was a dynamic and exchange, not only commercial, but also cultural between these two regions. But we can definitely not saying that there were attempts for colonization. Also because we know from some Akkadian texts that the different Akkadian kings tried to not probably colonize, but still impose some military control over parts of Oman. And they always mentioned local components. They never mentioned some foreign components in Oman. So what we presented today, is, at least from my point of view, very informative, but is also very limited in terms of numbers. I mean, these few objects tell us a lot of information, but we still have just a few cases confined to a few sites that were probably strategic for some reasons. And also, we don't see, for example, any influence from the Indus about architecture, for example, which is something that would have been probably immediately implemented if they were trying to colonize, or they have a more extensive presence in the region. While architecture, rituals, everything was local, with this minor but very important component from the Indus.
Okay. One more related question is that at the end you were telling about some of the few hypotheses of how there could be a possibility of Indus families marrying the locals. So what is the basis of these observations or hypotheses?
The basis of this specific information is just that it's a possibility, because we saw that these few sites like Bata and Salut ST1 that we have not only objects related to trade, like seals and their use, because the use of Indus inscribed objects, administrative objects, locally is testified by the impression of that stamp before it, that jar before it was firing locally. But we also have a lot of objects related to daily life, like cooking pots, storage jars, toys, games. We have some, you know, the typical terracotta bird toys with wheels from the, which are typical of the Indus. And we have ornaments, we have other evidence that suggests something, that something was going on beyond the mere trade exchanges. Because I don't see any reason for trading cooking pots unless you want to continue, or not trading, making, because most of the Indus type cooking pots were made actually at the site in Oman. And they, as I say, they were, you know, better than me, they were extremely complex pottery containers to be manufactured. They were made in different pieces, joined together with different clays for the bottom, at the top, slipped and not slipped. So they were very complex. And the only reason for making those vessels on the side was that you wanted to continue cooking your food in your way. Like, you know, it's full nowadays of Chinese families or even Indian families at the airport with their handy or woks that they moved to the US or to Europe, bringing along their kitchen implements because they want to continue cooking with their the way they were used to. So I think with the due distinctions, of course, but the situation might be seen this way.
Thank you. Thank you, Dennys, again for this wonderful talk. Now I request my colleague Sharda to moderate the question and answer session. Sharda, please.
Yeah, thank you, Prabhakar sir. So I will begin with the ones in the Q&A box, and then I'll just skim through the chat box to see if I've missed out. So the first question is by Shikha Rai, who asks, is it possible to identify community type through material evidences, whether these materials were used by traders or sailors who were frequently coming to Magan region from Meluha? Probably they were only mediators for maritime exchange activity, or do we get any presence of Meluha village as we find in Mesopotamian context?
First of all, this concept of a Meluha village in Mesopotamia that was proposed in the late 70s by Asko Parpola, Simo Parpola, is probably a misconception, because later studies by different Assyriologists told us that Meluha was also a common name in the Sumerian onomastics, and that Meluha village was to be read as the village of Mr. Meluha, not the people from Meluha. So something like that. Let me read again the long question in the Q&A. So basically, as I already replied to part of this question in the answer to Prabhakar, we don't have any evidence for Indus enclave in Oman. We have just a few evidence suggesting the fact that Indus Umm an-Nar settlements might have included, for some periods, we don't know if permanently or for some period also, people from the Indus that remain in Oman enough time to allow them producing some of their implements and also bringing along some craftsmen like potters or other people. So considering the original definition of a Mameluka village, even if it's questioned, I don't see a similar evidence in Oman. Also because these villages or enclaves in Mesopotamia for foreign people were organized politically. The governor of the city often provided them a specific street or a specific land to build their village. So there was a very strict political organization, which is not present in Oman, or at least we don't have any evidence for comparable evidence. There was another question about the term for boat in Mesopotamia, which is not...
Yes, I was about to take that.
Yeah, which is not trivial because there are a lot of speculation. The term for boat in Mesopotamia is ma, in both Sumerian and Akkadian. But ma or cuneiform sign can be read for their phonetic value or their the objects they represented. In the case of Magan, the ma has to be read for its phonetic value, not for its significance. So I read many times that the Magan means something like the people of the land of the sailors or the people of the sailors or something like that. That's completely wrong. And Magan was just translated phonetically in Sumerian and Akkadian. So this means, and it's very interesting, that it was most likely a foreign word. So it was probably the word that the people, the Umm an-Nar people, the people in Oman, used to define themselves and their land in the 3rd millennium BC. So to summarize, Ma is the word for both in Mesopotamia, in both Sumerian and Akkadian, but it has nothing to do with the possible translation of Magan.
Okay. So we can move to the next one. This is by Mr. T.S. Subramaniam, who asks, what is the significance of a Harappan seal found at Salut, which is an interior region of Oman? It will not be a surprise to find Harappan seals in Oman's coastal areas. Does the occurrence of the seal in Oman show that the Harappan traders had traveled deep inside Oman?
Yes, definitely. This is the results of my presentation, which what I think, and the most interesting is that seal is typical Indus seal. It has the right iconography, the right inscription, but it was made using the local stone. So, or at least it was not made in the Indus. So for some reasons, people active in external trade, that they decided to have their seal made locally when they were already in southern Mesopotamia or in Oman. Unfortunately, we don't have analytic confirmation that specific stone was local. It just macroscopically, visually resembled that used locally for making soft stone vessel. But unfortunately, there is not yet comprehensive studies about chlorides like those, for example, made by Randall Law for steatite. So we cannot say yet that that seal was specifically made in the area of Salut, but this is most likely the chance. So the reason why I don't know exactly, because we don't know the exact mechanism of Indus external trade, but it's definitely important to consider the fact that some people involved in Indus external trade made their own seal once they were in Oman. So tracing the movement of people through objects is also complex, but we are putting together some solid pieces of evidence. I think that people from the Indus were present in Oman, and they were active in Oman for quite a long time.
Okay, so the next one is by Mr. Jaipal Singh Jadeja, who asks if there are any early Harappan artifacts which have been found in these areas, or from these areas.
No. Apparently the Indus started exchanging with Oman after the mid-3rd millennium BC, not before. We had grooved shirt that looked like the typical Kodiji style grooved jars, but after neutron activation, it resulted being manufactured in Oman. So it's probably, and the chronology was not, that in any case was not matching the chronology of early Harappan objects. Mark Neuer originally explained that with the possibility that because in Harappa they have some Kodiji type vessel used still into the second half, the first century of the second half of the 3rd millennium BC. But this was not the case. It was just a false hypothesis because it was manufactured in Oman. So no, we don't have any early Harappan artifacts.
Okay, so the next question is by Jay, who asks, well, first he thanks you for the stimulating presentation, and the question that comes to his mind is, what contribution might this knowledge make to our understanding of the controversy about Aryan invasion theory or out of India theory?
Nothing.
Okay, so the next one is by Shilpa Wadekar from Pune, who asks, is there any genetic evidence of Harappan people in Oman population?
No, because first of all, we have very few studies, DNA studies about the Indus. And the DNA study of Indus, Omani people, the ancient Omani people, began just a few years ago by the Harvard University. But as far as they didn't publish any paper yet, but as far as I know, they didn't find they didn't have any positive result yet, because the arid environment of Oman is terrible for the preservation of collagen into human and animal bones. A few years ago, we even tried to radiocarbon dating two camels from a Sasanian tomb, so 3rd to 5th century AD, and they were not able to find any collagen to be dated. So DNA in Oman is still an evolving research, and we don't have any evidence yet to be compared.
Okay.
Sorry, I see a question about the use of QR code in my initial slides. It doesn't have any symbolic evidence. If you use it, you access to my academia.edu page, so you can read and download my papers.
Okay, so the next one is by Ritvik Balwani, who asks, do we have evidence of steatite beads found around in this region which were markedly Indus in the region? What is the significance in the region, either by its presence or absence?
So there is the question of steatite beads in Oman is quite complicated, because there are local sources, and they independently developed the technique of heating and glazing them. We have low-fired steatite beads even glazed in the Hafid period, in the second half of the 4th millennium BC. But also, we also have some evidence of beads imported from Oman, from the Indus, sorry. In our last paper about HD1, which is available on my academia page, thanks to analysis carried out by Randall Law, we were able to demonstrate that some steatite disc beads we found at Ras Al Had HD1 were actually imported from the Indus Valley.
There's a similar question, but for another type of artifact. So this is by Mitesh Dayani, who asks, are there any evidences of shell objects or ivory objects or ivory from the Indus, basically the Kutch region?
So we don't have, there are a few conch shells in Ras Al Jins, but usually the Umm an-Nar communities just rely on their own shells for their production. They mainly use them to make ornaments and some tools. For example, they use pinctada shell to make fishing hooks and some other fishing implements and some ornaments. They use a lot of conus shells for making rings that were traded also to Mesopotamia. There is a large exploitation of local marine shells in Oman. But they, as far as we can say, they never developed ritual, for example, significance, local ritual significance. They were only used for utilitarian purposes. I was trying to find this this question because maybe I missed some parts. But
no, this was in the chat box. So I
in the chat box. Okay.
Yeah, I just clubbed it with that because you're talking about artifacts and raw materials. There's another question on another raw material, that is on flint. So Pratap Chandran S asks, have you tried to look into the export of flint from Oman to Indus for blade making purposes, both for the tons of the commodity needed at Indus sites and also as a load for the incoming vessels to stabilize them?
So the flint knapping tradition of the two regions is quite different, mainly that period. Oman has a lot of chert and flint, and they develop their own techniques. We didn't perform any instrumental tests yet, but there is only one possible evidence for a long Indus blade found at the site of Bat, which is distinctive, is visually macroscopic, at least resembles the Roril chert, and also the shape, the morphology and technique used to make it is most likely Indus, of Indus origin. But for the moment, this evidence remains unique. So there is not, it's not a trend, it's not a pattern that we can isolate of exporting chert tools or flint tools from the Indus to Oman for any specific reason. You mentioned ivory also in the previous question. That was, I forgot. There are 2 ivory combs found in Oman that decorated with dot and circle motifs, which are typical of the Indus civilization. And we in Ras Al Had HD1 found the ivory handle of a small tool or something like that that was missing. More interesting is the discovery at the site of Tel Abrak in the UAE, the northern coast, right inside the Strait of Hormuz, of several ivory combs still attached to the combs of the dead in the Umm an-Nar tomb, Two of them were decorated with geometric and floral motifs that are typical of Central Asia. We have the same motifs carved on vessels, for example, stone vessel in Gonur Tepe in Turkmenistan. And my opinion is that there was a kind of a circular trade with these objects going from the Indus to Central Asia, or manufactured in Central Asia by itinerant ivory carvers from the Indus, that were then traded from Central Asia to the Oman Peninsula with these strange floral motifs and geometric patterns that are, as I say, typical of Central Asia. So they testify to a very complex network of exchanges that involved different actors from the Indus and from Central Asia and from Oman. So it's one of my favorite examples to show how complex were exchanges and cross-cultural exchanges in that period.
So there are two questions that have been asked by 2 or 3 participants commonly. So first one is, are there any ethno-archaeological evidences of Indus natives having intermarried with locals and settling at such sites, or there are only archaeological evidences? And so a similar question is there any, or could there be any markers other than cooking pots that could point to these intermarriages or matrimonial alliances?
So intermarriage is just an hypothesis, because we cannot exclude the possibility that people moved and began married with some locals. This is something we cannot exclude, of course, but we don't have any evidence to say that this is more likely than just Indus family moved. We don't have any data to go that far beyond in our interpretation. And from an ethno-archaeological point of view, there is no evidence, because of course we are thinking about 5,000 years ago. So no, there is no ethno-archaeological evidence. And the other question was
another common question was about the evidence of boat building traditions and their similarities, if any, with Indus maritime activities.
The problem is that we don't have any evidence for seagoing vessels from the Indus. We have some representation on seals, but they were most likely river boats, not seagoing vessels. And unfortunately, probably because they were built along the coast, and the coast is shifting, and in any case, the soil is not favorable for preserving archaeological materials. We don't have any evidence for boat making in the Indus. Either in Oman, we don't have, for that period, basically, we don't have any archaeological evidence. We only have some cuneiform text describing the material that were necessary to build some boat types. And we, of course, have mentions in cuneiform text of boats of different sizes, different capacity, and for different routes, but we cannot go beyond that.
Okay, so the next question, I'm also going to club this because they are quite similar. So besides adapting the pottery and bead making technology from Indus civilization, did these communities also adopt their construction technology or modify it? And a similar question is, do we see any pattern of presence of Indus element in particular areas of the settlement, or any specific area of the settlement from where we are getting these Indus materials? So something to do with settlements and the construction technology.
No, building techniques where we don't have any evidence. We know that, for example, Indus bricks were highly standardized, and there is no evidence for the use of those type of bricks in Oman. They have their own brick size and brick making technologies, and there is even no evidence for specific parts of the settlements devoted to these Indus communities, because we found that the archaeologists who excavated the sites found the objects in mainly damp areas, not in primary contexts. And there is another problem that is related with the archaeology, not the archaeology of Oman, but the social economic organization of the societies there. We have these towers, which were these huge platforms, but they were not used as a residential area we have very few evidence for villages, because they have a different concept of settlement. So their settlement was very sparse. They were probably, because their availability of water was different. So they have to exploit to their maximum possibilities the availability of water, which probably led to the creation of this sparse settlement with small, not villages, but part of the villages in even quite far away one to the other. So they didn't develop the concept of city like in the Indus, because it was not possible with the environment and the resources they had. So they were extremely successful in adapting their economic and social strategies to the environment they had to live in. But this led to a different, not only social political, but also economic and settlement organization. And they are barely comparable one to the other, the Oman with the Indus. And this is also interesting because you see two completely different cultures based on different concept and organization interacting one to the other. So you can also try to isolate cultural interaction, if any, and of course, limited to the material evidence we have.
So Akinori asks, what do you think happened to the Indus-Omani trade after 2000 BC?
Hi, Akinori. I didn't see is in the Q&A or?
In the chat box.
In the chat, okay. So after, I think this is a tricky question because he's a great expert of this period. After the disaggregation of the Indus civilization as an integrated socio-political economic system, we still see some interaction, some trade during the late Harappan period, the first centuries of the late Harappan period with the Gulf and Oman. We have evidence for Sorat pottery and Jokar pottery in the Gulf and also in Oman, even if unfortunately that from Oman was poorly published. And also because there are, if I'm not wrong, entire vessels from cemeteries in the Gulf region, in Bahrain, but just a dozen of sherds from Sur, just north of Ras Alad in Oman. So definitely for at least 2 or 3 centuries, the interaction continued, even after the disaggregation of the Indus civilization as a coherent political system and socioeconomic system. And this is very interesting because, as far as I know, long distance trade with other regions, including Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and Iran, were discontinued after at the beginning of the second millennium BC. So some special bonds, economic or cultural, were probably established between Southeastern Arabia and the Indus Valley to resist this political and economic breakdown in the Indus Valley.
Okay, so the next one is by Kumaran, who asks, what are the properties of this Salut beige sandy ware?
I'm not an expert of that. It's published on a paper by Sophie Marie. It's available on my academia page. I don't know exactly the mineralogical properties of the local ware versus the Indus one, but it was clearly identifiable. And of course, Sophie Marie is an expert of from both methodological and cultural perspective of this topic. So there is, I don't know if we want to go back to the slides discussing this, showing this ware is here. And the thread, yeah. There were probably both compositional differences and also difference of treatments in the different components, which are finer in the Omani wares than the Indus ones. But I don't want to enter into the details because I'm not the right person for the moment to. But this is published, so there is indication of the paper on the bottom of the slide, and this is available in my academia page. So.
Okay. So we'll just take up 2 or 3 questions more. So this is by Professor P.J. Cherian, who asks, are there any assumptions on how the Omanis Chalcolithic culture declined or later evolved into the Iron Age phase?
This is an interesting question because, of course, actually, the definition of the use of Chalcolithic in Oman is something we are trying to introduce now, because in the traditional chronology, both the Fifth and the Umm an-Nar periods are considered early Bronze Age. But this is a technical problem of methodology that that we are trying to solve now. The Bronze Age in Oman is very long. It's 1.5 millennium, and includes the Hafid period, which is now the Chalcolithic, the Umm an-Nar period, is the early Bronze Age, the so-called Wadi Suk period. They are all names after local sites where these phases were first identified. The Wadi Suk period, which is in the first half of the second millennium BC, and the late Bronze Age, they are trying now to differentiate between. The Wadi Suk period was at the beginning from 2000 to 13,000 BC, and now they're trying to differentiate between middle and late Bronze Age, but let's say the Wadi Suk period. The greatest breakdown was between the end of the Umm an-Nar, so the early Bronze Age, and the Wadi Suk period, which is the middle and late Bronze Age. So after 2000 BC, there was such a major breakdown in Oman, they stopped basically interacting with the neighboring regions. There were very few goods imported from abroad. They changed the way they funerary ritual. They started developing local pottery types, some styles in material culture, weapons, and that were typical. According to some scholars at the beginning, they proposed that this was due to the major breakdown in Mesopotamia with the conquer from Iran or the Indus Valley. But we know now that this process began already when the Mesopotamia was still flourishing under the third dynasty of Ur, and the Indus was still in the later centuries of this major phase. So it was a local process, a local phenomenon that was probably due to a local reaction to a tendency toward political centralization and economic hierarchy fostered by wealth acquired through long-distance trade in copper and other goods. So the local tribal society probably reacted toward this tendency for political centralization and social hierarchy and economic hierarchy to reaffirm these traditional values of kinship bonds and poorly stratified tribal society. So the Wadi Suk period is probably a response in these terms. While there is not a major breakdown from this period to the early Iron Age, there is a gradual reintroduction of cross-cultural exchanges. There is gradual development in material culture and funerary rituals. The two major breakdowns were between the Bronze Age, the early Bronze Age and the Middle Bronze Age, and later between the early Iron Age and the late Iron Age, because the late Iron Age probably involved also the movement of populations from northern Arabia and eastern and western Arabia to Oman. So I hope I was able to reply Professor Cherian's question.
Okay, just two more. So the first one is by P. Sumabala, who asks, was there any technology transfer from Indus to Oman, especially for making bronze objects?
Not for bronze objects, because even if we call the Bronze Age, bronze, actual tin copper bronze was introduced much later in Oman. For specific reasons, mainly because there were no sources of tin in Oman, so it had to arrive from quite far away. Second reasons, which is we are trying to investigate now, for its own geochemical properties and composition, Omani copper is quite strong by itself. In fact, in some cuneiform texts, Omani copper was called the strongest copper or the strong copper. And according to some geochemical analysis in Mesopotamia, Indus copper was used for making bronze, while Omani copper was mainly used as pure copper, because probably it already has some mechanical characteristic that didn't require its use for making for bronze. So of course, metallurgy is very complex. Ancient metallurgy is a complex field of research, and but apparently, for what we can say now, the Omanis developed their own metallurgy independently already during the mid 4th millennium BC, and they continue to develop their own techniques and technologies. So we cannot see any major technological transfer from the Indus to to Oman, or from Mesopotamia to Oman.
Okay. So there's one question by Akshita Suryanarayan, which I think is kind of already answered. She had asked about if there were any studies on the human remains to trace childhood origins, such as through strontium analysis, that could help identify these migrants. As you said, there are very few studies, and the collagen preservation is.
Yes, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
And the main problem is that we know that we don't have burials from in the Indus, or very few of them. So I don't see any reason for the Indus people to be buried together with hundreds of local people. We don't know. We should. I'm not an expert of forensic anthropology, but I'm sure that some colleagues tried to carry out DNA analysis of all those skeletons buried together, also to understand if their relationships in terms of family, tribe, how close they were to be buried together. But for the moment, the results are not very consistent, mainly because of this difficulty in obtaining DNA from those human remains. Interestingly, in the UAE, in two sites, there are one Indus weight from one tomb and one seal. So something that is more closely related to the individual. It's not an ornament, it's not something that, so it would be great to have the analysis of the bones from those individuals, if possible, of course. There is the silver ring that I show you today with the short-horned bulls is from a communal tomb. And we have 6 or 7 silver rings, which result. We identified them, Randall Law analyzed them, and we are still waiting for the results. There are lead and so silver sources also in Oman. So they may have been made locally or imported from the Indus as finished object. But that grave also provided Indus pottery, a lot of ivory fragments. Unfortunately, the preservation is very bad, and mainly something that I didn't mention today because it was kind of secondary. Together with the large communal tombs in the Umm an-Nar period, they also have funerary pits. Probably the ritual involved also the movements from mainly the smaller tombs, the movement of skeletal remains from the main grave into these pits. So it's extremely difficult to relate. First of all, of course, the objects, the bones tends to break, and it's almost impossible to relate the objects with the bones. So it's something that I hope we could develop further in the near future with the refinement of the excavation techniques and the analysis for testing DNA. But for the moment, we cannot say anything about this possibility.
I think we've covered most of the questions. So, yeah. Michelle, do you have?
Read out one question. One question which is really interesting. It is by Shika Rai. Is there any specific area of settlement from where we are getting the Indus material from the Oman sites? And do we get to see any pattern of presence of Indus element in particular area of the settlement?
No, I already replied to this question. I say no, because most of the objects were found in damp areas, not in the primary context of use, or from graves. For example, from Tower ST1, which is the site that yielded the seal and the stamped jar, these objects were found inside the ditch surrounding the tower, which was not always full of water. For most of the months, it was dry. And there are evidence for fireplaces, working areas, workshops in the ditch. And most of the Indus pottery and also the seals, they were from that area. So, but it was not a residential area, of course. So we cannot say that specific parts of the settlements were devoted specifically to people from the Indus, even because we cannot say which was the actual scale for this phenomenon, but we don't have evidence for that.
Okay, we are getting the end. Michelle, if you have any questions or?
Well, I was just curious to know if, you know, that there's been much speculation that Harappans imported copper from Oman and possibly beyond. Have you seen any evidence? We don't have proper metallurgical studies, I know, but indirect evidence of such, because again, the presence of Gulf objects in the Indus civilization, as you pointed out, is very, very small. So what else could we expect as the...
The problem is that for the Indus, it's not easy to obtain permission for instrumental tests. So there is a paper by Professor Bisht with Randall Law and other scholars about copper objects and silver objects from Dolavira, which is available from the web. The main problem is that if you don't go into very much detail, the composition of Omani copper and copper from Baluchistan is very similar, because they are continuation of the same ophiolite. So the composition is very similar. We should try to analyze some, for example, some plano-convex ingots, like that from Lotal, for example, which could allow us understanding, because we know for sure that that type of ingot was made in Oman, because we found hordes of those ingots. We found also the remains for their productions, but we don't know exactly if in the Indus Valley they made the ingots in that exact shape, which is most likely because we don't have evidence for other ingot types. So it's a complex topic, because as you say, there are a lot of speculations, but very few solid data. And I think we should try to remove a lot of speculation and try to think from scratch about this. For example, there are also in Oman, there are a lot of speculation, for example, about these Magan boats. Because one of the main outcomes of Professor Tosi's research was that they were made in Oman and that they were made to sail to India. But we don't have any evidence for that. And most of all, I find extremely difficult that they developed the technology that required the import of bitumen that was extracted 2,000 kilometers far away. So we should try, yes, to reconsider some firm points that are considered traditional because of repeating them by eminent scholars. But nowadays, with the refinement of instrumental analysis and also some theoretical approaches, we have the possibility to perfection and to sometimes change our minds, which is one of the founding principles of science.
I would have one very quick question. One of your slides showed a few Harappan names of traders or suspected names. Is there any paper anywhere that sums up all the Harappan names that have been identified or suspected across this whole region, the entire Gulf? Is there any? Are you aware of any publication that?
Not yet. We are trying to find. So these are sure, because the text say that this Nanasa and Samara were people from Melucca, and Samara was married with this lady that had a Sumerian name, which was most likely a local person. This is also one of the reasons why we propose that one of the possibility also for Oman was intermarriage. Something interesting in this text is that they are considered as royal donaties, which in I don't have the original text here, but I don't remember the Sumerian term for this royal donaties is very specific. There are important studies about them. So they were basically high-rank slaves. We don't know if they were acquired through, in which way of this status of slaves is an adaptation for something that is more connected to a paid worker with not many rights in terms of movement, and we don't know. But they have this kind of strange status. But my colleague Gianni Marchesi, who is extremely involved in this, in the study of people from different origins embedded into the Sumerian and Akkadian society, apparently found that one of these two individuals is mentioned in one or two more texts. He's trying to collect all the evidence for possible Indus persons, Indus individuals in Mesopotamia, and publish them. The problem is that we know from later historical examples, like the most famous is Sikander for Alexander the Great, that there was this use of localizing foreign names or to translate them phonetically, mainly when written, into something that is no longer recognizable as a Greek or a Harappan name in this case. So all, for example, the studies that we tried to make, or some colleagues made, trying to identify the linguistic background for these names are very difficult, and also in absence of a very big data set, they are very poorly substantiated in terms of theoretical background, because we can imagine a lot of different changes, phonetic changes, adaptation that made all a castle of cards, basically. But still, it's very interesting to see slowly that to go from the objects to the person, to the individuals. This is my main goal, long-term goal. But let's see what happens.
Okay, thank you very much.
It was great to interact with all of you.